So picking up where we left off with the level below. In this part, we're simply continuing the same process to build out the rest of it. I'll be using the layout I created earlier in pre-production as a guide, just to keep the room shapes and overall scale consistent. I'll keep referring back to this layout as I build. We're starting with the first room. The wall I've already placed, this red one at the back, matches this section here on the map. With that set, let's move forward. First step, I'm going to remove the default floor since it's no longer needed. Now that a few base elements are in place, we have a clear scale reference. We won't be using this floor piece, so I'll select it and delete it. Alright, taking another look. We've already set this back wall to be 5 units long. As a reminder, each wall segment is 4 meters long, based on the scale in the design plan. For this west wall, we need 4 segments going in this direction. So to set that up, I'll select the corner piece and press E to bring up the rotation tool. I'll hold Alt and rotate this 90 degrees to duplicate it. Using Alt works with both the move and rotation tools. Also, quick tip, if the transform handles get in the way, you can switch to the select tool. Just press Q to select without the gizmos. Alright, let's continue. We need 4 segments here. The first one is already in place. I'll press W to switch to the move tool, then hold Alt and drag to duplicate again for 3 and 1 more for 4. Now for the wall on the right, I'll hold Shift and click to select all 4 pieces. Then I'll hold Alt and drag to duplicate. This also works with multiple selected pieces, which speeds things up quite a bit. Now I just need to fill in the floor. Since everything is aligned to 1 meter increments, I can increase the grid size to place pieces even faster. I can change the grid size from the drop-down up top, or do it faster with the bracket keys on my keyboard. As I press the bracket key, you'll see the grid size adjust right on the floor. That's the bracket key just above Enter or Return on your keyboard. If you've used Photoshop before, it's the same shortcut used to adjust brush size. So I'll set the snapping grid up to 100, then hold Alt. As you can see, this makes placement much faster. There's a small glitch there, but using Alt to duplicate still works fine, and now the entire floor is filled in. Next, we'll do the same thing for the ceiling. And as you can see, working on a grid really helps. It saves a lot of time and keeps everything consistent. At this point, you can probably see why this setup is useful. If I turn the grid off and try placing things manually, it quickly becomes messy. Right now, I've got a slight overhang because of how everything is aligned. So I'll reduce the grid back down to 10 using the opening bracket key, then shift this over by 1. Now everything lines up properly. What I want is for these grid lines to match the wall grid here, so everything stays clean and consistent. I was going to demonstrate this from the inside, but that brings us to the next step. We now have the space fully enclosed. When we hit play, we'll move the player start into the room and run it. Right now, it's completely dark, almost nothing is visible aside from a bit of light leaking in the corners. We'll fix that later. For now, to properly test an interior space, we need to add some lighting first. You'll notice the auto exposure kicking in, slightly brightening the scene. We'll come back to that shortly. First, let's add some lights. I'll open the Place Actors panel, go to the light section and start dropping in a few point lights. We'll start with just 1 light for now. Next, I'll move the player start next to our scale reference. Since that reference was placed around here in the level, we want the player to begin in the same area. We'll remove the scale reference later. It's only there so I can judge the character's scale and how the space feels. Starting with just 1 light doesn't look great right now. The scene is still very dark, but it's enough to see what's happening. If we press play, we can move around the space and everything is working as expected. Now about auto exposure, it becomes more noticeable when we start adding art assets, but for now it can make things harder to see while we're prototyping the level. Auto exposure is a lighting feature in Unreal that simulates how your eyes adjust naturally. As you move between bright and dark areas, it shifts the exposure over time. For example, when you go from a bright outdoor space into a darker interior, your eyes take a moment to adapt to the change in light. That's exactly what auto exposure is designed to mimic. In a finished game, you might want to keep it, but while we're building the level, it can be distracting and even lead to misleading lighting decisions. So we're going to disable it. To do that, go to Project Settings and use the search bar at the top. I'll type exposure into the search bar, which brings up the engine rendering settings. From here, I'll find auto exposure and turn it off. Now the scene stays at a consistent brightness, making it much easier to light accurately. Next, I'll duplicate the light using the Alt key, just like duplicating any other object. Now our first room is set up with the correct dimensions. Looking back at the level map, we need a 4-meter wide opening and a 4-meter hallway leading into the next room, centered on this wall. That means we'll have 3 units on each side of the opening. Facing this direction, we count 1, 2, and remove the middle piece. I'll delete that section. Next, I'll extend the wall by duplicating the 4-meter segment outward. I'll do the same for the ceiling, then press E to switch to the rotation tool. From there, I'll hold Alt to rotate and duplicate the pieces into place. This wall is slightly off by about 10 centimeters, but that's easy to fix. Since snapping is still off, I can just nudge everything back by 10 units. Now the room and the hallway are both in place. Before we go further, I want to keep things organized as we build. If you wait too long, sorting a large level later becomes time-consuming and messy. So we'll organize things as we go. It keeps everything cleaner and easier to manage. I'll open the outliner panel and make sure it's pinned open. Right now, the level is already split into 5 main sections, so I'm going to mirror that structure here in the outliner. We'll do this using folders. The default lighting objects are already grouped into a folder, but anything we add should be organized the same way. To create a new folder in the outliner, just right-click in an empty space. I usually right-click on the main level root at the top, then choose Create Folder. I'll name it Room 1. Since everything we've built so far belongs to this room, I can just select all those objects and move them into the folder. I simply click the first item, scroll down, hold Shift, and click the last one to select everything in between. Then I drag it all into the Room 1 folder. Now I can collapse the folder, keep working, and everything stays neatly organized by room. Before we continue, there's one more quick thing to cover about lighting. By default, Unreal Engine 5 uses Lumen, which we touched on earlier. Lumen is Unreal's dynamic global illumination system. The technical side is a bit beyond this course, but in simple terms, it just makes lighting behave more naturally and realistically, the way you'd expect it to. You can see I've added a few lights, including an exterior light, and everything is being lit as expected. Light is coming in through the opening and naturally bouncing around the space in a realistic way. Now I want to show the difference between using Lumen and not using Lumen. I also want to show how to turn Lumen on, just in case it's been disabled or wasn't enabled by default. If you started a fresh Unreal Engine 5 project, it should already be on. But if you're coming from Unreal Engine 4 and upgraded your project, it might not be enabled automatically. In that case, it may not be enabled by default. So let's go over how to turn it on or off. Go to Project Settings, then scroll down to the Rendering section. Find Global Illumination and look for the setting called Dynamic Global Illumination Method. Set it to Lumen, that's what we want. Just to show the difference, I'll set this to None. I'll move the settings window aside so you can still see the scene clearly in the background. Now watch what happens when Lumen is turned off. This is the older, legacy Unreal lighting system. As you can see, the lighting and shadows don't look as clean or as natural as they did with Lumen. So if you run into lighting issues, just double-check your project settings under Rendering and make sure Dynamic Global Illumination is set to Lumen. Also, your reflection method should be set to Lumen as well. Now that our first room is complete, it's time to move on to the second one. Looking at the level map, we enter through this north wall. From there, it extends 1 unit in this direction and then 1 by 3 units down this way. Let's start building this section. I'll begin by duplicating the pieces I already have in place. They're already aligned where I need them, so it saves time compared to placing new ones and lining everything up again. First, I'll increase the grid size back to 100, then hold Alt and drag to duplicate. Since everything is already organized in a folder, I can easily reuse these pieces and continue building from here. This piece was originally inside the Room 1 folder, so when I duplicated it, it stayed grouped there. But this actually belongs to Room 2. So before continuing, I'll create a new folder, right-click, and name it Room 2. Then I'll move this piece into that folder to keep everything properly organized. I can either drag and drop it directly, but it looks like I accidentally created a subfolder under Room 1. No problem, I'll just delete that. Now I'll select the object in the viewport, which highlights it in the outliner. From here, I can either drag it into the correct folder or right-click and move it that way instead. If your outliner gets crowded and dragging becomes difficult, this method is much easier. Just right-click the object, go to Move To in the outliner menu, and select the folder you want. It instantly places it into that folder. Now when I duplicate from this piece, everything will automatically stay organized inside the Room 2 folder. It's a good habit to place your first duplicate into the correct folder early on. That way you don't end up sorting a mess of objects later once the prototype is finished. Now I'll do the same process here. Hold Alt to duplicate, drag it out, rotate it, and then move it into the Room 2 folder. And there we go. You'll notice these wall pieces still show up as box in the outliner even though they're labeled as walls here. That's just because when we created them with the Mesh Modeling Toolkit, the default name was box. Instead of re-importing or recreating them after renaming, I simply duplicated from that original box asset. Even if I rename it here, Unreal still generates names based on the original instance in the outliner. So you'll see things like Box 1, Box 2, Box 3, and so on. If you're working in a team or just want better organization, it's a good idea to go back and rename these properly, like Wall 1, Wall 2, Wall 3. I'm not going to go back and rename everything right now. I might clean it up off camera so we don't waste time on it here. But I will rename this one so you can see how it works in Unreal. Just select it in the outliner or right-click it. And I believe it's. You can rename it by going to Edit Right Arrow Rename or simply selecting it and pressing F2. I'll name this one Wall 20. Now when I duplicate it, the naming continues automatically, so this becomes Wall 21. Holding Alt to duplicate, you can see it carries the naming forward. Now we've come out by 1 unit, so next we need to go down by 3. I'll press W for the Move tool, then place it down, 1, 2, 3 units. I'll keep the floor underneath as I build. Now looking at this from a top-down view, you can start to see the layout taking shape. I'll bring up the level map beside it so we can compare. At this point, we've got this room forming, plus part of the next room started. Before we go any further, I want to do one more quick organizational step. I'm going to separate the ceiling pieces into their own subfolder. You'll see why this helps in a moment. With Room 1 selected, I'll right-click and choose Create Subfolder. I'll name this subfolder Ceiling. Now I'll grab all the ceiling pieces and move them in. This is another reason why proper naming matters. Since everything started as box, I now have to manually figure out which pieces are ceiling, wall, or floor in the outliner. Good naming would have made this much faster and clearer. But when things are properly named, I can quickly select all the ceiling pieces at once and drag them into the ceiling folder. The reason I'm separating the ceiling is because I'll often switch to a top-down view, and I need to be able to see the layout clearly underneath it. With all the ceiling pieces in one folder, I can just toggle the visibility icon to hide them in the editor. That lets me clearly see what's happening underneath. And just to be clear, this doesn't affect the game at all. When I press play, the ceiling is still there. I'm only hiding it in the editor view, not removing it from the level. This is just an editor visibility toggle. Nothing is being removed from the level. Now let's keep building. We want one more floor section going this way before we reach our first bottomless pit. So I'll extend that shape by selecting the pieces, holding Alt and dragging them out. Same process for the walls. Now we need to create the drop-off area, so the walls will have to extend down to support that section. Let's do that now. The first pit is only 1 wall unit wide, so it's pretty simple. I'll Alt drag the pieces out 1 more unit, about 4 meters. Now we need walls going down into the pit, so I'll duplicate these pieces downward, then copy and rotate them 90 degrees to match the new direction. If you see this flickering, that's called Z-fighting. It happens when 2 surfaces occupy the same space in 3D, which the engine can't properly resolve. In this case, it's the floor and the wall overlapping in the same position. There are a few ways to fix it. First, I'll close the outliner for now and select the overlapping pieces. You can lower the grid size to 10 and simply nudge the geometry down 1 step. The downside is that your alignment won't be perfectly clean anymore. Another option is to create a single overlapping piece that bridges both surfaces and hides the seam. That's likely the approach we'll end up using here. But for now, let's keep building the walls, floors, and ceilings. We'll come back later for a second pass on this prototype to add details like columns and other structural elements. Quick fix here, I left the grid snapping at 10, so I'll press Ctrl+Z to undo, set it back to 100, and continue building with the correct spacing. This is a good point to test our first obstacle. We've got Room 2, a gap, and then the other side where we can potentially jump across. Before continuing the build, I'll quickly test it. I'll hit play in the editor, move the character around, and use space to jump. We're doing this to make sure the player can actually clear the gap with the current jump settings. And as you can see, it's easily possible. Just keep in mind this is an introductory section, so it's not meant to be difficult. The first obstacle should be simple and readable. It looks like we can clear the gap with no issue, so we'll continue building. From here, we move out 2 units before hitting this wall. So I'll select the next section, hold Shift, and drag it out to extend it. How you handle these transition spaces is up to you in terms of layout and design. For example, you can decide whether this hallway belongs to room 1 or room 2 in your organization. That's entirely up to you. In my case, I'll assign the hallway between rooms 1 and 2 to room 1 and the hallway between rooms 2 and 3 to room 2, and so on. Now we can just keep building from here. I'll drop the grid back down to 10 and nudge that piece into place for a smoother corner. Later on, we'll do a second pass to add details like columns, archways, and doorways. For now, I'm just keeping everything as clean and simple as possible. Room 2 is in good shape, everything as organized. Now the last step is adding the ceiling. I'll start duplicating the pieces using Alt and set the grid back to 100 to make placement easier. Before I continue duplicating, I'll move this into room 2 and set up a ceiling subfolder right now. I'll create a ceiling folder and place the ceiling piece inside it. Now, as long as I duplicate from this source, everything will stay in the correct folder automatically. It looks like I'm off by about 10 units on this wall, so I'll drop the grid back down to 10 to fix it. If you ever need to work up close and your gizmo feels out of reach, just use Ctrl+D to adjust your selection, then Ctrl to reselect and continue working. Now your gizmo should snap back to the last selected piece. Let me quickly verify by checking the grid lines. It looks like everything is off by about 10 units in this direction, which means this section is also shifted by 10. You can really see how much time you can lose trying to perfectly align everything, even with a grid. Without it, it would take even longer. Alright, now things should be lined up properly with the grid lines. It still looks slightly off, but there we go. At this stage, it doesn't need to be perfectly precise on every single line. The reason I'm spending extra time on this is because of these walls. Eventually, all of these blockout pieces will be replaced with final art assets. For large repeating surfaces like walls, floors, and ceilings, we'll use tiling textures, materials that repeat seamlessly across surfaces to build out the environment efficiently. Tiling textures only really work well when everything is properly aligned and the repetition matches cleanly across the surface. That's why it's worth taking the time now to keep things lined up correctly. If you don't, you can run into problems later when you bring in final textured assets like visible seams, mismatched tiling, or broken alignment. At that point, you'd have to fix the texture setup, adjust the mesh size, or even build extra pieces to cover gaps. All of that is possible, but it's much easier to avoid the issue up front. Doing this work up front just saves you headaches later on. Now we've ended up with another dark space since we added the ceiling. So I'll bring in a couple of point lights again. And just to be clear, this isn't our final lighting setup. This is only for testing the level so we can actually see what we're building. Don't worry about making these lights look perfect just yet. We can move from room 1 into room 2, jump the gap, and everything still works as expected. This is why early and frequent playtesting matters during prototyping. It would be a big problem to finish the whole level and then realize the player can't actually make that jump. If that happens, I'd have to shift this whole section over just to make the jump possible. And then I'd also need to realign everything built off this area, which quickly turns into a lot of extra work. That's why you should always playtest while you're building. Now let's move on and look at room 3 in our level map. We can see the transition hallway here, which matches up with this section right here. From here, we go 2 units north and 2 units south. I'll start by alt-dragging to extend the layout. But before I continue, I'll set up the folder structure first. You'll notice these 2-point lights aren't in any folder. That's because I dragged them directly from the Place Actors panel. Anything added this way or from the content browser won't automatically go into your folder setup, so you need to organize it manually as you go. So you'll need to remember to organize those manually. And again, I accidentally created another subfolder. No problem, I'll just delete it. Alright, now I'll move this piece into the room 3 folder. We said the layout goes 2 units up and 2 units down. It looks like we have 2 floor units before we hit the larger pit in room 3. I'll select everything and duplicate it across, keeping that 2-unit width. Then I'll continue extending the pieces like before. I'll also take a moment to line everything up so the grid lines stay consistent. And I just realized I forgot to move these into the Room 3 folder, so I'll grab both and drag them in now so I can keep duplicating properly from the correct setup. I can also build it this way. Now let's check our progress. We're currently at this point here just to reorient ourselves. I'll switch to the top-down view so we can compare it directly with the layout. On my screen, I don't have much space, but that's fine. We've got this room here and then this next room with the pit starting right here. We've now built out this section of the floor. So next we need to extend this wall. From this point, it looks like we have 6 grid units, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 up to the outer edge here. And overall, this section measures about 8 units, depending on where you count up to this outer wall. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll switch back into perspective mode. From here, we've got 6 units, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That tells us this edge lines up with this wall right here. Then in the other direction, we've got 5 units, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is starting to give us the basic shape of the room. This wall just comes straight out to meet the other side, and the opening sits right in that corner. We can leave this for now. We also have this 4x4 floor section here, so I'll move it into position. It looks like we need to fill in this corner as well, so I'll duplicate the pieces here and here to complete the shape. We actually need one more piece for this room. Looking at the level map, there are sections that aren't 4x4, they're more like 4x1 strips. So we'll create those pieces now. I'll use the same method we used for the floor pieces to build them out. We created it earlier by duplicating the mesh and separating it into its own asset. We'll do the same thing here. I'll duplicate this piece and right beside it switch into modeling mode. With the piece selected, I can start editing it directly. I'll go into mesh, then choose duplicate. I'll rename it since it's no longer a 4-meter floor piece. It's now a 1x4-meter floor section. I'll also keep delete inputs enabled. And just to clarify that setting briefly, if you don't delete inputs, the original source geometry stays linked, which isn't what we want here. Basically, this setting controls what happens to the original piece. With delete inputs enabled, it removes this specific 4x4 instance, not the original asset, and replaces it with the new version I create. If I set it to keep inputs, then the original piece would stay and I'd end up with a duplicate underneath instead. That's all it means. Personally, I prefer to duplicate the mesh first, then separate it, and only delete the input afterward. If you want to keep the original instead, you can set it to keep inputs, and then duplicate it as a separate piece to work with independently. This is just personal preference. I find it less confusing this way. So I'll repeat the same process. Duplicate the mesh, go to mesh duplicate, rename it, and keep delete inputs enabled. Now we have a new reference for a 1x4 floor piece, but we still need to actually shape it into a 1x4, which is easy enough. We could just scale it down, but there's an issue with that. Right now, the Y scale is set to 0.25, which means if we reset it, it goes back to the original 4x4 size. So even though it looks smaller, the mesh is still technically a 4x4 piece. There are a couple of ways to properly bake that change in. The first option is to simply bake it in. So I'll scale it down to the size we need, but before committing to that, I want to make sure it's actually wide enough for the player to run across. To check that, I'll do a quick playtest, but I don't want to go through the first 2 rooms again since I already know they work fine. I could move my player start here so I always spawn in that spot. Or for quick testing, I can just right-click anywhere in the level and choose Play from here, which spawns the character exactly where I clicked. And it looks like this section is wide enough for the player to run across comfortably. So it looks like we'll stick with the 1x4 size. Now that we've confirmed it works for the player, I'll head back into the modeling mode panel. I'll scroll down to the transform section. As we covered earlier, this is also where you can adjust the pivot point for the mesh. But instead of adjusting the pivot, we're going to use the bake button. This stands for bake rotation and scale. What it does is apply any changes I've made to rotation or scale directly to the mesh. So instead of those values just being temporary, they get permanently baked into the asset. So this becomes the new default state for the mesh. I'll hit bake, but I don't want to bake the rotation, only the scale. So I'll uncheck bake rotation and press accept. Nothing changes visually in the level at first, but if you look at the piece now, you can see it's truly a 1x4 mesh instead of the original 4x4. Now I'll just hold Alt and start duplicating these smaller pieces out. Since we've already created a proper separate reference, everything will stay consistent later when we swap these out for final mesh pieces. Nothing will get broken or mismatched. We just need to connect these sections again using the 1x4 floor pieces. Now we've got the basic bounds of the room laid out. I'm going to pause the recording here, and when we continue, we'll finish the rest of this level's first pass, just focusing on walls, floors, and ceilings. I'll see you in the next video.